Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to explore something that, honestly, almost all of us feel, but very few of us actually have the words to describe. We're diving into the invisible psychological weight of modern work. If you've ever ended a day feeling completely drained, even though you didn't do anything physically demanding, or if your brain is just buzzing when you're supposed to be relaxing, well, you're in the right place. We're using a fascinating research framework to make sense of this modern pressure we're all under. We aren't here to diagnose you or prescribe some magical quick fix. Instead, we're just going to look at the systems around us, reflect a bit, and hopefully bring some much-needed clarity to our daily lives.
Let this statement sink in for a second. You are not lazy. You are overloaded. So many of us are walking around feeling this incredible guilt because we're just tired all the time. We think, come on, I should be able to handle this. I'm just sitting at a desk all day. But the lived reality for the modern worker is that we're functioning while carrying a massive invisible load. It's a persistent psychological condition. You are not failing at being disciplined. You're just actively functioning under a state of chronic overload. Okay, let's dive into this by confronting one of the most pervasive myths out there about exhaustion. For the longest time, society has framed burnout as an individual resilience problem, right? Like it's a sign of personal weakness. But the reality is actually the exact opposite. The data shows burnout increasingly hits high performers, the reliable employees, the emotionally responsible folks, and caregivers. The people breaking down aren't weak at all. They're actually highly capable and resilient. In fact, a lot of high performers hide their distress precisely because they are so competent. They just keep pushing and pushing until the system completely depletes them.
Section 1. A systems design problem.
So this exhaustion, it isn't a personal failure, it's a systems issue. And to really get that, we have to look at what modern work environments actually reward. They explicitly reward your responsiveness over deep, focused thought. They reward your constant availability over your basic need for recovery. They prioritize immediate output over long-term sustainability and urgency over reflection. People are literally just adapting to systems that never stop asking for more. Work just follows us home now, doesn't it? Through notifications, messaging apps, and this expectation of digital availability. We're carrying technological, economic, and emotional pressure into our jobs every single day. And the system absolutely never tells us to put it down.
Section 2. Chronic cognitive fragmentation.
Now, to understand why we feel so drained, we have to look at what this environment is doing to our attention. It's something called chronic cognitive fragmentation. Basically, the human brain is increasingly being forced into constant context switching. We're dealing with interrupted attention, rapid-fire prioritization, and simultaneous digital streams all day long. Because of this, our nervous system never truly feels off duty. Over time, this constant fragmentation dramatically chips away at our mental clarity, our emotional patience, and our creative depth. It's exhausting just thinking about it.
And all of this creates a deeply painful disconnect. On the outside, you might look totally fine and completely functional. You're answering emails, hitting your deadlines, showing up to meetings. But the internal reality is pretty stark. We're talking fatigue, irritability, emotional numbness, and this persistent, low-grade anxiety. Just total mental exhaustion. People are out there maintaining this polished facade of external capability while quietly navigating some really intense internal depletion.
Section 3. Invisible emotional labor. You know, it's not just the cognitive tasks that are draining us. We also have to factor in this massive hidden drain on our psychological energy. We call it invisible emotional labor. This is the totally unstated requirement of modern professionalism. It's the expectation that you're going to maintain emotional control, stay perfectly calm under intense pressure, play workplace diplomat, and constantly regulate your own reactions. This labor is incredibly real and it consumes huge amounts of energy. But because it's invisible, we rarely get credit for it, and we almost never recognize it as a valid reason for feeling so wiped out by 5 p.m. When you add it all up, you start to see the full scope of our daily jobs. We aren't just processing tasks or moving widgets around. We are constantly managing environments. We're managing impressions. We are carefully calibrating the exact emotional tone of our emails and Slack messages, so we don't sound too blunt. We're managing our responsiveness so everyone knows we're on, all while navigating these constantly shifting social expectations. Honestly, you're doing 2 jobs at once, the actual work and the emotional management of the workplace itself.
Section 4. The performance identity trap. So what happens when you combine that chronic cognitive fragmentation with all that invisible emotional labor? Well, highly capable people tend to fall into what we call the performance identity trap. This is a psychological state where you actually derive your safety, your self-worth, and your very sense of survival from your own competence. Think about it. If you're known as the reliable one or the high performer, your ability to function and deliver isn't just a job requirement anymore. It literally becomes tied to your identity.
And this builds into a really dangerous psychological loop. Let's walk through it. First, your baseline stress goes up because of systemic overload. Then, because you have this performance identity, you respond to that stress by leaning into the very thing that makes you feel safe, your competence. Performance basically becomes your survival mechanism. And here's where it gets really toxic. Because your safety is tied to doing, rest actually starts to feel threatening. Finally, slowing down triggers immense guilt. The individual ends up completely trapped between their deep exhaustion and their own identity.
Section 5. Why rest fails us.
This identity trap leads us straight into a really painful paradox. You know the feeling? You take a weekend off or even a vacation, and you come back feeling just as tired as when you left. Researchers call this passive exhaustion. You might be physically sitting still on your couch, sure, but psychologically, you never actually recover. Why does that happen? Because your nervous system remains activated by the constant pings of your devices. The systemic mental load of your work is completely unresolved. Your attention is still fragmented by digital streams, and since your core identity is tied up in productivity, you just end up feeling guilty for resting. Physical stillness just cannot provide restoration if the brain is still actively processing systemic overload.
And how do most organizations respond to all of this? Usually with Band-Aids. They'll offer up some wellness messaging, maybe a subscription to a mindfulness app or a mandatory resilience workshop. But these Band-Aids completely ignore the actual systemic issues driving the burnout in the first place. We're talking about meeting overload, completely unclear priorities, fragmented communication spread across 5 different platforms, and this relentless culture of constant urgency. It creates a deeply frustrating contradiction. Organizations are basically attempting to help people survive the very systems they refuse to redesign. So the crucial point here is that the conversation is slowly, finally, shifting from quote-unquote employee well-being to organizational sustainability. Because, let's be real, this is no longer just about making people feel nice. Cognitive overload directly degrades decision quality. Emotional exhaustion absolutely destroys collaboration and innovation. When an entire workforce is operating with chronic cognitive fragmentation, it's not just a wellness issue anymore. It is a critical operational risk for the entire organization.
As we've seen today, if you're feeling drained, the answer isn't that you lack discipline, and it certainly isn't that you're lazy. You're existing in a system that constantly demands your attention, your emotional regulation, and your availability, without ever designing a space for your psychological recovery. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this framework helps you make a little more sense of that invisible weight you might be carrying right now. And before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought to reflect on today. Why do so many of us feel mentally busy even when we are physically still?